The ruins of New Chicago stretched out before Sergeant Callum Graves like the bones of a long-dead giant. The city had once been a beacon of progress, its skyline a testament to human ingenuity. Now, it was nothing more than a graveyard, a monument to the war that had turned Earth into a battlefield. Smoke curled through the shattered remains of skyscrapers, the streets littered with the wreckage of war machines. Both human and alien. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of shifting metal echoed through the ruins, a sign that the enemy was still searching, still hunting. They always were. Graves tightened his grip on his rifle, the familiar weight grounding him. His armor was scorched, his face streaked with grime and blood, some of it his, most of it not. He moved with careful precision, stepping over broken concrete and twisted steel. His squad following in silence. They had learned long ago that noise meant death. The Vassar weren't like any enemy humanity had faced before. They were relentless, towering beings with 4 arms and thick, chitinous armor that made them look more like nightmares than soldiers. Their war machines had blackened the sky, their weapons had turned cities to ash, and their cruelty had been the last lesson millions of humans had learned before dying. But Earth wasn't finished. "Movement, north side," whispered Corporal Elena West, her voice a breath in Graves' earpiece. "Looks like a patrol, 5 of them heavily armed." Graves crouched behind the remnants of a crushed transport vehicle and peered through the cracked scope of his rifle. The Vassar patrol moved with the precision of conquerors, their massive forms casting eerie shadows in the flickering firelight. Their armor gleamed under the pale glow of their hovering drones, plasma rifles clutched in clawed hands. They were cautious now, more so than they had been in the early days of the war. Back then, they had stormed into cities expecting an easy victory. They had learned the hard way that humanity wasn't so easily broken. "Let them pass," Graves murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "No unnecessary engagements. We're ghosts, remember." The squad remained motionless, blending into the ruins. The Vassar patrol advanced slowly, their mandibles clicking in their guttural language. Graves didn't care what they were saying. They weren't here to talk. He watched as they moved past, their shadows disappearing into the darkness. West exhaled. "Close one." "Too close," Graves admitted, "but they'll be back. They always come back." It was the way of war now. The Vassar had overwhelming numbers, superior technology, and an empire that spanned countless worlds, but they didn't have patience. That was humanity's greatest weapon. Silence, waiting, striking only when it hurt the most. The aliens had mistaken Earth's sudden lack of communication as a sign of surrender. They had expected broken spirits, not hidden soldiers lying in wait. They had been wrong. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "Sergeant, command says we're go for the operation. Time to send a message." Graves allowed himself a grim smile. "Copy that. Let's remind them why Earth isn't theirs yet." The squad moved through the ruins like phantoms, their steps silent, their movements precise. The Vassar had occupied what was left of downtown, using it as a staging ground for further advances. If humanity was going to turn the tide, they had to hit the enemy where it hurt. Graves' squad was one of many scattered across the ruins, setting the stage for the next phase of resistance. "Eyes on the target," West reported as they reached the edge of a collapsed overpass below. The Vassar had set up a command post, a crude fortress of alien steel and pulsing energy barriers. Dozens of soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their weapons humming with lethal potential. Massive quadrupedal war machines stomped through the streets, scanning the darkness with their glowing sensors. Graves took a deep breath. "All right, people, we do this right. We cripple their advance. We do it wrong. Well, let's not do it wrong." West chuckled softly. "Motivating as always, Sarge. It's a gift." They spread out, taking positions along the wreckage. The explosives were already in place, hidden beneath debris, tucked inside abandoned vehicles, woven into the very fabric of the ruins. It had taken weeks of careful planning, of setting traps without being detected, but now, all that patience was about to pay off. Graves tapped his earpiece. "All teams, stand by. Wait for my signal." The Vassar had no idea what was coming. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. The Vassar continued their patrols, oblivious to the death waiting in the shadows. Graves watched the lead officer, a towering brute covered in ornate armor, barking orders to his subordinates. He had the look of a conqueror, confident, untouchable. Graves pressed his transmitter. "Fire." The night erupted. A dozen explosions tore through the Vassar ranks, fire and debris consuming everything in their path. The command post shuddered as walls collapsed, Alien screams filling the air, smoke and dust swallowed the battlefield as secondary charges ignited, setting off a chain reaction of destruction. Then, silence for a moment. The only sound was the distant echo of falling rubble. Then the gunfire started. Graves and his squad opened fire, their rifles spitting death into the chaos. The Vassar scrambled, disoriented. Their once organized formation thrown into disarray. Soldiers fell, their bodies torn apart by bullets and shrapnel. War machines whirred to life. But before they could retaliate, another explosion rocked the ground, sending one crashing into the ruins. "Push forward," Graves shouted, his voice barely audible over the carnage. His squad surged ahead, weaving through the smoke, cutting down the enemy before they could regroup. The Vassar fought back, their plasma weapons carving glowing scars through the darkness. Graves felt the heat of a near-miss sear past his arm. But he didn't slow down. This was what they had trained for, what they had become. They weren't fighting for glory, they weren't fighting for territory, they were fighting because they had no other choice. The battle raged on, the ruins of New Chicago once again bathed in fire. Graves reloaded, his hands moving on instinct, his mind already calculating the next move. They had struck hard, but the Vassar weren't broken yet. They were rallying, their commanders barking orders, calling in reinforcements. More war machines were advancing, their cannons charging, ready to level the battlefield. Graves tapped his earpiece. "West, tell me we've got something left." "We do," she replied. "It's just big." Graves grinned. "Bigger the better, do it." A moment later, a new explosion rocked the ruins, this one brighter, hotter. The sky itself seemed to ignite as an overhead structure, rigged with hidden charges, collapsed onto the advancing Vassar. The war machines disappeared beneath tons of falling metal, their screams cutting off in an instant. Then, for the first time, the Vassar did something unexpected. They ran. Graves watched as the surviving enemy forces began retreating, their once fearless formation broken. He exhaled, lowering his rifle. The silence of Earth had fooled them. Now it was the last thing they heard. The tunnels beneath the ruins of New Chicago stretched for miles, a labyrinth of forgotten infrastructure now repurposed for survival. It had been years since the trains last ran, since the city above had been more than just a graveyard. Now, the tunnels were home to the remnants of humanity's resistance, soldiers, scavengers, and the unlucky few who had nowhere else to run. Sergeant Callum Graves moved with his squad through the underground corridors, their boots crunching on loose gravel and debris. The dim glow of their helmet lamps cast jagged shadows along the walls, illuminating faded advertisements for stores that no longer existed and a future that had never come to pass. They had barely escaped the Vassar bombardment above. The alien counteroffensive had turned New Chicago into a smoldering ruin, wiping out entire districts in an effort to cleanse the battlefield. If they had still been up there, they wouldn't have stood a chance. Graves pressed his fingers to his earpiece. "Bravo squad, report you still with us." A crackle of static, then a voice came through, Lieutenant Aaron Holt, leader of Bravo squad. "We're here. But it's bad. We lost half our people in the first wave. The rest of us are holed up in the maintenance tunnels near Sector D12. The Vassar are sweeping the area. We need to move fast." Graves swore under his breath. "Understood. Sit tight. We're coming to you." West, still favoring her injured leg, tapped him on the shoulder. "How bad?" "Bad," Graves muttered. "We need to get to Bravo before the Vassar do." No one argued. They picked up the pace. The tunnels weren't safe. They never were. The Vassar had long since learned that humans used underground pathways to avoid their patrols, and they had adapted. Drones hovered through the dark, their blue scanning beams slicing through the shadows. Hunter squads moved in tight formations, their weapons primed for ambushes. The squad moved in silence, their rifles ready. Keller took point, his keen eyes scanning ahead. Harlow covered the rear, his grip on his weapon tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Every step was a calculated risk. They were nearing the rendezvous point when Keller suddenly halted, raising his fist, the universal sign to stop. Graves moved up beside him. "What is it?" Keller didn't answer. He simply pointed. Ahead, in the dim flickering light of a long-dead service panel, stood a figure alone. It wasn't human. The Vassar soldier was different from the ones they had fought above. It was taller, thinner, its armor more segmented, more flexible. A scout. No doubt the Vassar were learning. They were adapting, and that meant only one thing. They were being hunted. Graves didn't wait. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot slammed into the Vassar's chest, sending it staggering backward, but it didn't fall. It moved faster than expected, shifting its weight, twisting to avoid a second shot before Graves could fire again. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, a signal. The tunnels erupted with movement. From the darkness, more figures emerged, not just soldiers, something worse. Vassar stalkers. They moved on all fours, their elongated limbs ending in razor-sharp claws. Their eyes gleamed in the low light, predatory and cold, silent killers, bred for one purpose: to eliminate humanity's ability to hide. "Fall back," Graves shouted, firing into the charging beasts. The squad scattered, finding cover where they could. Gunfire filled the tunnel, bullets slamming into armored hides, but the stalkers were relentless. One of them lunged at Vasquez, claws tearing through his armor before he managed to drive his knife into its throat. Another slammed into West, knocking her off balance. Graves fired until his rifle clicked empty, then switched to his sidearm. A stalker leaped at him, and he barely managed to duck in time. It sailed over his head, landing with inhuman grace before spinning to attack again. They were surrounded. And then the tunnels exploded with light. A hail of bullets tore through the air, cutting down the stalkers in an instant. The Vassar scout barely had time to react before its head snapped back, a clean hole punched through its skull. A familiar voice shouted from the far end of the tunnel. "You guys always bring this much trouble." Graves turned to see Lieutenant Holt, and what remained of Bravo's squad pushing forward, their rifles still smoking. Holt's expression was grim, but there was a fire in her eyes. They weren't dead yet. Graves let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're late." Holt smirked. "You're just early." The two squads regrouped deeper in the tunnels, taking stock of their injuries. Vasquez was bleeding, but stable. West's leg was worse than before, but she refused to stop. They had lost Keller in the fight. His body left behind in the darkness, another name to add to the ever-growing list. "What's the situation topside?" Graves asked. Holt shook her head. "Not good. The Vassar are bringing in heavy reinforcements. Their warships are locking down every major city. They're not just hunting us anymore, they're preparing for something big." "An extermination," West said bitterly. Graves clenched his jaw. They had fought so hard, survived so much, but the war wasn't getting easier. If anything, it was getting worse. "Then we hit them first," he said. Holt arched an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you propose we do that? We're outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of places to hide." Graves pulled a small, battered data chip from his pocket. "Intel we recovered before New Chicago went up in flames. We couldn't access it before, but if we can find someone who can decrypt it, we might have a way to turn the tide." Holt took the chip, rolling it between her fingers. "And you think it's worth the risk?" "Do we have a choice?" Graves asked. Silence filled the tunnel. Finally, Holt nodded. "Then we move." The war wasn't over. Not yet. The underground air was thick with the scent of dust and fear, the stale remnants of a world that once hummed with life. Now, it only whispered with the echoes of humanity's struggle for survival. As the two squads moved deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels, the weight of their loss was a constant presence. Keller's death still hung heavy, but it was a reality they could not afford to dwell on. Graves led the way, his pace steady but his mind racing. The decrypted intel was their only shot, a fragile thread of hope in a war that seemed destined to consume them all. The Vassar were relentless, an enemy unlike any they'd ever faced. Their technology, their tactics, they were always one step ahead. But for every victory the enemy claimed, there was a price, and Graves was counting on that. "How much further?" Holt asked, her voice breaking the silence. Graves glanced at the map on his handheld device, the glowing blue lines showing their path through the tunnels. "A few more clicks. We'll hit the surface at the extraction point." "Extraction point?" West asked, limping slightly but still keeping pace. "We're getting out?" "Not yet," Graves said, his voice hard. "We need to deliver that intel first." They continued to move in silence, the faint hum of Vassar drones growing louder as they approached a deeper section of the underground network. The intel had pointed to an old research facility buried beneath New Chicago, an abandoned lab, long since forgotten, where one of humanity's last remaining scientists was rumored to be hiding. If anyone could decrypt the data, it was Dr. Mikhail Voss. But getting to him would be another battle altogether. "We'll need to be quick," Graves said, glancing at the squad. "Voss isn't exactly in a position to hold off the entire Vassar force." Holt nodded. "We're ready." They moved with purpose, each step bringing them closer to the surface. As they neared the extraction point, Graves could hear the faint rumble of Vassar warships in the distance, their engines reverberating through the very earth. The sky above, once the realm of hope, was now the domain of the enemy. There would be no safe place for them in the open. They had to stay hidden. Stay silent. The extraction point was an old maintenance shaft, a remnant of a city that no longer existed. They reached it in less than an hour, but the sight that greeted them was anything but reassuring. A massive, Vassar transport ship hovered just above the ground, its hulking frame casting a long shadow over the tunnel entrance. The ship's red energy cores glowed ominously, casting a sickly hue on everything beneath it. The squad froze, the hairs on the back of their necks standing at attention. "Back!" Graves hissed. "Into the shadows!" They scrambled for cover, pressing their bodies against the walls of the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them whole. Graves could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how close they were to being caught. The transport ship hovered above the shaft, its engines whining as it slowly descended. The ship's undercarriage opened, revealing a dozen Vassar soldiers, their segmented armor gleaming in the dim light. They moved with purpose, spreading out in tight formations. It was clear they were searching for something, or someone. "Vassar forces," Harlow whispered from the rear, his eyes wide with alarm. "They know we're here." Graves held up a hand, signaling for everyone to remain quiet. His mind raced. There was no time to waste. They had to reach the lab, or all of this would be for nothing. The ship's ramp lowered, and the soldiers began their patrol. Graves motioned for the squad to follow, moving silently behind the Vassar as they advanced toward the facility. The shadows were their only ally now. They reached the old lab's entrance, a rusted door half hidden by collapsed debris. Graves knelt down and examined the lock, his fingers working quickly. The door groaned as it creaked open, revealing the dark interior of the lab. The air inside was stale, tinged with the musty scent of forgotten experiments. Papers were strewn about, and the remnants of old machines lay dormant in the corners of the room. But in the center, sitting hunched over a small console, was Dr. Mikhail Voss. His hair was wild, his eyes bloodshot, but when he looked up and saw Graves and the others, a spark of recognition flickered in his gaze. "I knew someone would come," Voss said hoarsely, standing up. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't spoken to another person in years. "What took you so long?" "We're on borrowed time," Graves said, stepping forward and pulling the data chip from his pocket. "Can you decrypt this?" Voss didn't hesitate. He took the chip, sliding it into a nearby terminal. The screen flickered to life, and the machine began processing the data. As it did, Graves couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something much bigger than they had anticipated. "How long will it take?" Holt asked, her voice strained with impatience. "Not long," Voss muttered, his fingers flying across the keys. "But what you're asking for, it's not just military intel. This is bigger." Graves exchanged a look with Holt, who raised an eyebrow. "Bigger how?" Voss paused, turning to face them. "This data contains the location of the Vassar's central command. Their heart. If we can strike there, we might be able to end this war." Graves felt the weight of Voss's words settle over him like a heavy cloak. If the intel was right, this was the key to everything. The enemy's fortress. Their Achilles' heel. "How do we get there?" Graves asked. Voss hesitated, then pointed to a map on the wall. "We infiltrate their most secure facility. But you'll need to move fast, and you'll need everything you've got." Graves nodded. They had no choice. The storm was already breaking above them. The time for waiting was over. "Then we hit them hard," Graves said, his voice firm. "And we finish this. The war wasn't over. Not yet." Dr. Voss's fingers danced over the ancient terminal, the glow from the screen reflecting in his bloodshot eyes the low hum of the machinery, and the soft rustling of papers in the windless lab were the only sounds that filled the space. Graves paced the room, his thoughts racing as he tried to piece together what Vash had just told them: the location of the Vassar's central command, a target that could potentially bring the enemy to its knees. This was their chance, the one opening they had been waiting for, but the cost of taking it, they could lose everything. "How long, Doc?" Graves asked again, his voice sharper this time. Vash didn't look up from the screen. "Minutes," he muttered under his breath. "The encryption's dense, I'll need a little more time." Holt shifted uncomfortably, her rifle slung low. "Time we don't have," she said. "The Vassar are still searching if they find us." "They won't," Graves cut her off. "We're already hidden. The moment we get what we need, we move out, no more waiting." "I hear you," she replied, tightening her grip on her weapon. "But you know what we're up against. We don't have the manpower for a full-scale assault." Graves stopped pacing and turned to face her. "It's not a full-scale assault, it's a strike precision. We go in, we take out their heart, and we get out. If this intel is right, we might have a shot at stopping them before they bring more forces down on us." Vash finally looked up, his eyes meeting Graves'. "It's not just the central command, it's where their ships are controlled, where their communication lines cross. If you take that out, it could send their entire operation into chaos. The problem is, you won't be the only ones trying to get to it. The Vassar will have their best troops guarding that place." Graves nodded, turning back to the terminal. "We don't need to fight everyone, we just need to hit them where it hurts." Vash hesitated for a moment, his face clouding with doubt. "You'll need something they don't expect, something that gets you close, something they won't anticipate." West, who had been leaning against the wall, came forward, her face hardening with resolve. "If it's the only way, then we make it happen. We've survived this long, we can survive this." Graves studied her, his eyes scanning over her wounded leg. He knew she was pushing through the pain, refusing to show weakness. The squad was tough, battle-hardened, but they were running on empty. "We'll need a way to sneak past their perimeter," Graves said, turning back to Vash. "How do we get inside without being spotted?" Vash ran a hand through his wild hair and sighed. "The central command is buried deep beneath the surface, inside a fortified facility called the Citadel. It's shielded and heavily guarded, but there's an old access route, a maintenance tunnel that was once used for supply drops. It's been abandoned for years, but it's still there. If you can reach it, it'll get you inside without alerting the main defenses." Holt raised an eyebrow. "Sounds too good to be true." "It's not perfect," Vash said, tapping a few more keys. "The tunnel's a risk. It's old, and some of it's caved in, but it's the only way in without facing 100 Vassar soldiers head-on." Graves felt the pressure mounting, but he could see the hesitation in the eyes of his squad. No one wanted to face another firefight if they didn't have to. "How long will it take us to get there?" Graves asked, looking at the map Vash pulled up on the screen. 2 hours if you move quickly," Vash said, pointing to a narrow passage on the screen. "You'll reach the entrance. Once inside, you'll be in a maze of service corridors. Keep your heads down, stay quiet, and don't engage unless necessary." "Understood," Graves said, nodding. "We'll move out as soon as you're ready." Vash looked back at the terminal and grimaced. "One more minute." Graves walked over to the table and began gathering equipment, checking his sidearm, and making sure his rifle was loaded. Holt and West did the same, the faint sound of metal sliding into place filling the room. Keller's absence was a heavy weight, and each of them felt it, but there was no time for mourning now. They had a mission. Finally, Vash turned to them. "It's done. I've uploaded the coordinates to your comms. You're good to go." "Thanks, Doc," Graves said, offering him a brief nod. "Stay here. If we make it back, we'll get you out." Vash gave a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere. You just make sure you come back in one piece." Graves didn't answer. There was no time for goodbyes. With a final glance at Vash, Graves turned to the door and led the squad out of the lab. The air in the tunnels felt colder as they moved deeper into the underground labyrinth. Every step seemed heavier, every echo in the distance a reminder that the enemy was always close. "Keep it tight," Graves ordered. "Move fast, stay quiet, and we don't stop until we reach the Citadel." They pressed on, their boots silent on the broken concrete, the tunnel lights flickering above them as they made their way through the dark. The farther they went, the more oppressive the silence became, as if the very walls of the city were holding their breath. Graves' mind kept returning to the intel, to the target, the Vassar's Central Command. If they could take that out, it could cripple the entire Vassar operation, and the war would take a dramatic turn, but there were no guarantees and the odds weren't in their favor. You ever think this is too much? West asked, her voice a whisper in the dark. I mean, what if it's too big for us? What if we're just one small group fighting an enemy that's already won? Graves glanced over at her, his gaze steady. If we don't fight, then they've already won. We may be outnumbered, but we've got something they don't, the will to fight. We're not done yet, and neither is this war. They rounded a corner, and ahead, a faint light flickered through a cracked doorway. The tunnel split in two here, one path leading to the surface, and the other to the maintenance tunnel Vash had told them about. Graves motioned for the squad to stop. He moved forward cautiously, peering through the cracked door to make sure no one was on the other side. The faint glow of a Vassar drone's scanning beam flickered in the distance, but there was no sign of patrols nearby. This is it, Graves whispered. Let's move. One by one, the squad slipped through the doorway and into the darkened corridor beyond. The air was thick with dust, and the ground uneven beneath their boots. It wasn't a perfect path, but it was their only shot. They moved in single file, rifles at the ready, each soldier acutely aware of the danger lurking just a few steps away. As they made their way down the maintenance tunnel, the silence was almost suffocating. The tension was palpable, each footstep a potential death sentence. Minutes stretched into hours, the only sound the faint hum of the ship engines far above them, and the quiet breath of the squad as they pushed forward. They kept their movements controlled, their eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Eventually, the passage narrowed, and the faint sound of rushing water echoed in the distance. The maintenance tunnel was reaching its end, and the citadel lay just ahead. Graves felt his pulse quicken. This was at the heart of the beast. The narrow maintenance tunnel ahead was cloaked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic beating of their hearts, and the occasional scrape of boots against the jagged floor. The walls, once pristine and clean, were now streaked with grime and moss, and the faint smell of stagnant water filled the air. Graves could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him like an invisible force, urging him forward. Stay close, Graves muttered, his voice low and steady as the squad pressed forward. We don't know what we'll find up ahead. Holt nodded and moved in behind him, keeping her rifle ready, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. West was next, limping slightly but determined to keep pace despite the sharp, burning pain in her leg. She didn't let it show. If anyone had reason to doubt their survival, it was her, but she refused to let that uncertainty seep through. Not now, not when the stakes were this high. The tunnel was dim, lit only by the faint glow of their helmet lamps. Every step seemed to take an eternity, and with each passing second, Graves felt the tension grow. The Vassar were relentless, and if they were even remotely aware of the squad's presence, they would be closing in soon. The idea of facing their enemy on their turf, in a place this deep underground, was a terrifying thought. How much further? West asked quietly, her voice hoarse from the strain of her injury. Graves glanced at the map once more. We're close, just a few more 100 meters, and we'll hit the central shaft that leads to the citadel. We're almost there, Holt added, her tone a little more hopeful than it should have been, given the circumstances. The squad continued to push forward, moving with practiced precision. The world outside felt far away, as though the war had been forgotten, reduced to nothing more than a distant memory. Only the immediate mission mattered now. They couldn't afford distractions. There was no room for failure. Suddenly, ahead of them, a faint mechanical hum pierced the air. It was distant at first but rapidly growing louder. Graves raised a hand to halt the squad. He leaned in, trying to place the sound, but his heart skipped a beat when he realized what it was. A drone, a Vassar drone. Graves gestured for the squad to duck behind a stack of debris and crouch low. The tunnel ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, but the drone's searchlight was growing closer, a relentless beam sweeping the area, looking for any sign of movement. Graves had always trusted his instincts. His gut had saved him more times than he could count, and right now, his gut told him they needed to stay perfectly still. The drone's light sliced through the dark, illuminating patches of old machinery and broken pipes. The whir of its engines echoed in the tunnel like the growl of a predator. It was a perfect hunter, silent, precise, deadly. Every inch it moved seemed to bring it closer to their hiding spot. Graves could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his breath shallow, controlled. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, by some miracle, the drone passed them slowly, silently. It drifted further down the tunnel. Unaware of the squad's presence, Graves let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, and the tension in the squad seemed to dissipate just a little. "Move!" Graves whispered. Without a word, the squad resumed their march, keeping low to the ground and moving swiftly. Each step was measured, each breath held. The next 100 meters felt like they were walking through fire. Finally, they reached the central shaft. It was a vast opening, a crumbling elevator shaft that led deep into the heart of the citadel. The edges of the walls were lined with old metal scaffolding, rusted from years of neglect, a forgotten pathway, untouched by the world above for years, but now, it was their way in. "This is it," Graves said, staring at the shaft. The walls seemed to narrow as they descended, as though the whole structure was built to trap those who dared enter. "You sure about this?" West asked, her voice shaking slightly from the tension of the moment. Graves didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice." He moved toward the edge of the shaft, securing a rope to a nearby fixture. It wasn't the most secure, but it would hold. The rest of the squad followed suit, securing their ropes, preparing to descend. "Ready?" Graves asked, looking at each of them. They all nodded, weapons ready, their eyes focused on the mission ahead. The descent felt longer than it should have. The further down they went, the more oppressive the air became. It was as though the very weight of the citadel bore down on them, pushing them deeper into its core. The rusted metal walls groaned beneath their weight, a reminder that this was no ordinary facility. It was an enemy stronghold. After what felt like an eternity, the squad reached the bottom. They landed with soft thuds, carefully releasing their ropes and checking their surroundings. The citadel loomed in front of them, a massive facility deep underground. The hum of vaster technology pulsed through the air, the vibrations tingling in their bones. Graves crouched down, motioning for the squad to take cover. The first wave had been easy, getting past the drones and patrols, but now, they were on the edge of the heart of the beast, and the heart of the beast never slept. "Stay sharp," Graves said, keeping his voice low. "We don't know what's waiting for us in there." They crept forward, moving slowly through the corridor that led deeper into the citadel. The walls were lined with vaster technology, displays flickering with encrypted data, strange symbols that Graves couldn't even begin to understand. The whole place felt like it was alive, a machine of death and intelligence, constantly calculating its next move. "Left," Graves whispered, pointing to a narrow passage. They followed, their movements swift and silent. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the citadel became. The air grew colder, and the smell of machinery and old metal filled their nostrils. There was a low hum in the air that sent a shiver down Graves' spine. He had been in enemy strongholds before, but this place was different. The Vassar had designed it to be impenetrable, and for all their skill and determination, they were still intruders here. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the hallway. Footsteps. Graves froze, signaling for the squad to hide. They ducked into a small alcove, pressing their bodies against the cold stone walls. A group of Vassar soldiers passed them by. Unaware of their presence, they moved in perfect formation, their eyes scanning the surroundings with mechanical precision. Graves' heart raced. It was close, too close. Once the soldiers were gone, Graves nodded. "Let's go." They continued deeper, the countdown ticking in their minds. They didn't have much time. The longer they stayed in the citadel, the greater the risk of being discovered, and once they were discovered, there would be no getting out. The central command room was just ahead. They could feel it. Graves reached the door, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. With one final look at his squad, he signaled for them to move in. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. The door hissed open, and they stormed in.